Dan had promised her forever, but when Sarah discovered the truth, everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and family unraveled in the most shocking way. 6 months pregnant, Sarah found out about her husband's secret wedding, and the betrayal went deeper than she could ever have imagined. What started as a dream life soon spiraled into a nightmare, leading her to a confrontation no one was prepared for. It all started like a fairy tale. I met Dan when I was just starting my career, eager to find my place in the world. He was confident, charming, and everything I had hoped for in a partner. We met at a mutual friend's party, and it didn't take long for us to become inseparable. Within a year, we were living together, and I felt like I had finally found someone who truly understood me. He made me laugh, supported me when I was struggling, and always knew exactly what to say to make me feel special. We talked about the future from the very beginning. It was never a question of if we would get married, but when. The first time he told me he loved me, I felt like I was floating. It was simple and sincere, and it felt like he was promising me a lifetime of happiness. We shared dreams of building a home together, of having children and growing old side by side. Every promise he made felt like a building block in a life that we were creating together. Dan was always so attentive. At every doctor's appointment, he would hold my hand asking questions, offering support. I was 6 months pregnant when we started picking out baby names, laughing over our favorites and disagreeing over others. It felt like a bonding experience, a way for us to step into this new chapter together. I never once questioned his dedication or his excitement about becoming a father. In fact, the thought of him as a father made me smile. He was everything I wanted in a partner, a loving husband, an excited father-to-be, and my best friend. Life seemed perfect. Our friends and family had been following our journey closely. We had our little circle, people who supported us and cheered us on through the ups and downs of pregnancy. There were baby showers, well wishes, and gifts arriving from relatives who couldn't wait to meet the baby. I had never felt so loved, so hopeful for the future. Everything was falling into place, but something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just small things that didn't add up. Dan's behavior had become slightly more distant. He was still kind, still there for me when I needed him. But there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. He seemed distracted sometimes, his mind elsewhere. I noticed that he was spending more time at work, sometimes even staying late for reasons I hadn't heard before. There was a subtle shift in his energy, and while it wasn't overt, I began to feel a growing unease. I told myself I was being paranoid. Pregnancy hormones, stress, the pressure of preparing for a new baby. Of course, he was busy. But deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, pushing the thoughts away, convinced they were just part of my own anxieties. After all, we were expecting our first child, and the excitement of it all was enough to make anyone feel a little overwhelmed. Still, that small sense of doubt lingered, creeping in when I least expected it. I convinced myself that once the baby arrived, everything would feel normal again, that life would settle into the rhythm of parenthood, and those strange little moments of distance would fade away. But as I would soon find out, life has a way of throwing the unexpected your way when you least expect it. It started with something small, something so trivial that at first I almost dismissed it. I was searching through my phone, trying to find a photo I had taken during one of our doctor's visits. Dan and I had been so excited about every milestone, and I had a ton of pictures to sort through. As I scrolled, I noticed a notification pop up on his email. It was an unfamiliar name, and the subject line caught my attention. The final preparations for the ceremony. My heart skipped a beat. My mind immediately jumped to conclusions, but I tried to reason with myself. It could have been related to work or some event, but that subject line seemed so specific. I had to take a closer look. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just a coincidence, some harmless mistake, or an email meant for someone else. I quickly pushed the thought aside, but the feeling lingered. Later that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept replaying the subject line in my mind, my curiosity gnawing at me. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, Dan had been nothing but supportive during my pregnancy. But then I found myself opening his email just to see what was going on. It was a decision I would later regret, but at the time I couldn't ignore the impulse. What I found inside that email shattered the world I thought I knew. The email contained a thread of messages between Dan and someone named Sarah. As I read further, my stomach tightened. There were details about a venue, arrangements for a wedding ceremony, and even instructions for a photographer. It was clear now. This wasn't about work. This was about a wedding. But not mine. My mind raced, the reality sinking in slowly. I kept telling myself that maybe this was a mistake, that it couldn't possibly be what it seemed. But the more I read, the clearer it became. Dan had been planning a wedding, and it wasn't with me. The wedding was set for a date in just a few weeks, a date I would have never expected. I was 6 months pregnant, and my husband, the man I had trusted with everything, was preparing to marry someone else. There was a guest list attached to the email, and my heart sank further as I scrolled through it. Among the names of friends, family, and acquaintances, one stood out above all the others: Sarah Henderson. The name sounded so foreign to me. I had never heard it before. Who was she? Why hadn't I known about her? Why hadn't... At that moment I was paralyzed. My mind was screaming at me to stop reading, to close the phone and pretend like none of this had happened. But I couldn't. I kept scrolling, hoping, foolishly, that I'd find an explanation, some context that would make sense of it all. Instead, it only confirmed my worst fear. Dan had been keeping a secret from me, one that was so big, so utterly life-altering, that I could hardly comprehend it. As I sat there, phone in hand, the weight of the betrayal crashed over me. I felt like I was drowning in confusion and anger. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind? Everything I thought I knew about our life together felt like a lie. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing seemed to add up. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I had to confront him. But even as I made that decision, the fear of what I would uncover next kept me on edge. Would he deny it? Would he have an explanation? Or worse, would he admit it and leave me to pick up the pieces of a life I had built with him, only to find out it was all a facade? My hands shook as I put down the phone, already feeling the weight of the conversation I had to have. The truth hit me harder than I could have ever imagined. I couldn't shake the images from the emails I had seen. Wedding plans, a guest list, and all the details that painted a picture of a life I had never been part of. My emotions swirled: anger, confusion, disbelief, but most of all a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal. My husband, the man I was expecting a child with, had been planning a wedding to another woman behind my back. I had to face him, and I had to face him soon. I waited for him to come home that evening, the quiet house only amplifying the chaos inside me. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't I seen the signs? I couldn't stand the silence any longer, so I decided to act. When Dan walked through the door, I could feel the tension thick in the air. I didn't wait for him to ask how my day had gone. I didn't care about pleasantries or small talk. I had no more patience for that. The moment he stepped inside, I threw the question at him. My voice trembled as I asked, "Dan, who's Sarah? And why are you planning a wedding with her?" He froze, his eyes widening, and for a split second, I saw panic in his face. But that panic was quickly masked by a forced calmness, as if he were trying to prepare himself for what he was about to say. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. He looked like he was calculating his next move, trying to figure out how to navigate the mess he had created. I don't know what you mean, he stammered. What are you talking about? I pulled out my phone, the same phone I had used to uncover the lies, and showed him the email thread. There in black and white was evidence of everything. I didn't want explanations that painted him as the victim. The truth was staring us both in the face, and it was undeniable. He was married, or on the verge of being married, to someone else, and I had been kept completely in the dark. For a moment, I could only stare at him, my heart beating so loudly in my chest that it felt like I was hearing it echo in the silence between us. I waited for him to say something more, anything that would give me some shred of understanding, but he only stood there, looking at me with an expression that was half defensive, half guilty. I could barely hold it together as I asked, "How long, Dan? How long have you been seeing her?" His response wasn't an answer, but an attempt to explain that it had started as a mistake, that it was something that just happened. But I wasn't listening to his justifications. His words felt empty and hollow, like a desperate attempt to wriggle out of a corner he had backed himself into. The more he spoke, the more it felt like he was trying to minimize the gravity of what he had done. As the minutes passed, I realized something else. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Dan's infidelity or the betrayal that I had personally suffered. This was something bigger, something far more insidious. I had been lied to not just by my husband, but by his entire family. That was the breaking point. I remembered his family, how close-knit they were, how they'd always been so supportive of our marriage. In fact, they had been the first ones to congratulate us when we announced our pregnancy. How could they have known and said nothing? How could they have been complicit in this? My mind began to race with questions that only led to more frustration. The silence in the room was deafening as I tried to process the depth of this betrayal, and then I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I called his family. It was time for them to face the truth, too. But nothing could prepare me for what would come next. I could barely contain my anger as I dialed Dan's family. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that his betrayal was not just his alone. It wasn't just his secret wedding that shattered everything. It was the fact that his entire family had been complicit in keeping it from me. They had known, yet they had said nothing. And I needed answers. I decided to invite them over, hoping that in person I could get the truth. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I certainly didn't anticipate what would unfold when they arrived. Dan's mother, sister, and aunt showed up on my doorstep the next evening. Their expressions were odd, unsettling in their stiffness, as though they had all been warned about something they weren't prepared to face. As soon as they stepped inside, I could feel the tension in the air. It was like walking into a room full of unspoken words. My pulse quickened as I led them into the living room. There was no small talk, no pleasantries. I got straight to the point, too angry to play games. "Dan's been planning a wedding with someone else," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "You knew, didn't you?" The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. His mother shifted in her seat, her gaze avoiding mine. Dan's sister looked at her hands, fiddling with her fingers as if trying to keep herself occupied. No one said a word for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Dan's mother spoke, her voice low, almost apologetic. "It's not that simple, dear," she said, but there was no emotion behind the words. "We didn't know how to tell you." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. How to tell me, as if there could have been an easy way to break this news. As if there was a right time or place for this kind of revelation. I felt my chest tighten, the sting of betrayal burning through every inch of my body. "You didn't know how to tell me?" I repeated, unable to hide the sarcasm in my voice. "You knew he was marrying someone else and you didn't think I should know?" Dan's sister, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke, but her words only made the situation worse. "We weren't supposed to tell you," she said, her voice almost whispering. "Dan didn't want you to find out like this." The truth was starting to unravel, but not in the way I had expected. They weren't just keeping a secret. They were actively protecting him from the consequences of his actions. They had chosen to let me live in ignorance, to let me believe that everything was fine when, in reality, I had been nothing more than an afterthought. It felt like a cruel game, a twisted version of reality where my pain didn't matter. "You let me live in this bubble," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and hurt. "You let me get excited about our future, about this baby, while you all knew the truth. How could you do that to me?" None of them had an answer. Instead, they exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly struggling with the weight of what they had done. But there was no real remorse, no apology. It was as if they were all part of some elaborate charade, and the curtain had finally come down. Dan's mother tried to speak again, but this time her words were weak and unconvincing. "It's complicated, you don't understand." She trailed off, clearly at a loss for how to explain herself. But I wasn't interested in hearing excuses. I didn't need her explanations. I needed the truth. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer, and paced the room. The truth felt suffocating, but it also made something clear. I had been living in a lie. The man I thought I knew, the family I had grown so close to, had all been hiding things from me. And I couldn't ignore it any longer. As the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that there would be no easy resolution. Dan's family had chosen their loyalty to him over any concern for me. They had enabled his lies, allowing them to grow unchecked, and now they expected me to somehow accept this twisted reality. My anger didn't subside, but something in me hardened. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me any longer. I wasn't going to stay silent, pretending like everything was fine. This was my life, my future, and I would no longer let anyone, least of all Dan's family, control it. As they left, awkwardly mumbling apologies and half-hearted reassurances, I felt a surge of strength. I was done being passive. I was done letting them decide what I should know and when I should know it. I wasn't going to stay in the shadows of their lies any longer. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful, and to take control of my own future. Days after the disastrous dinner with Dan's family, I found myself still reeling from the shock. I thought confronting them would bring some kind of resolution, but instead, it only deepened the betrayal. My world felt like it had been turned upside down, and I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. The more I thought about it, the more the realization settled in. Dana's secret wedding was only the tip of the iceberg. The entire foundation of my life had been built on lies, and now there was no going back. I spent hours questioning everything, retracing every step of our relationship, every conversation, every small moment that now seemed tainted. How could I have missed all the signs? How had he hidden this from me? But the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, and I couldn't undo it. Then came the invitation. The thick envelope arrived, just like a slap in the face. It was elegant, sealed with wax, and the weight of it in my hands felt almost symbolic. Inside was the official invitation to Dan's wedding. My stomach twisted in knots as I read the words, "The marriage of Dan and Sarah Henderson." The ceremony was scheduled for the following weekend. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Here I was, 6 months pregnant, and my husband was marrying someone else. He had been so wrapped up in his lies that he didn't even bother to tell me he had already sent out the invitations. It felt like a cruel joke, one that I was forced to live through. I could have thrown the invitation away and pretended I never saw it. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't let him get away with this. I couldn't let him walk down the aisle with another woman while I was left in the dark carrying his child. I made up my mind. I would go to the wedding. I wasn't sure what I would do once I got there. But I couldn't just sit back and let him pretend everything was fine. I needed closure, and I needed to confront him, no matter what the consequences were. The day of the wedding arrived, and I could barely breathe. My hands were shaking as I held the invitation in my grip, staring at the elegant words on the paper. It felt surreal, like I was walking into someone else's nightmare. I slipped into a simple black dress, something that would make me blend in at the ceremony, and headed to the venue. It wasn't far, just a few miles from our house, but each mile felt like an eternity. When I arrived, I stood outside the large church watching the guests trickle inside. The garden was beautifully decorated, the kind of fairy tale setting I had always dreamed of for my own wedding. But there was no joy in it for me. My stomach churned with dread as I realized how much I had been deceived. This was supposed to be my life, my happy ending, but it was being stolen right before my eyes. I stood by the entrance staring at the guests who were already seated, trying to find some familiar face among the crowd. But as I scanned the room, I saw nothing but strangers. The doors to the church opened, and there, standing at the altar, was Dan. He looked so sure of himself, so confident, as if nothing had ever happened between us. And standing beside him was Sarah, beautiful, poised, and completely unaware of the storm that was brewing just outside. I didn't know what to do next. I stood there for what felt like forever, frozen in place, watching the wedding unfold before me. I wasn't sure if I should confront him now in front of everyone, or if I should leave and never look back. But then, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about me, it was about standing up for myself, for my future, and for the child I was carrying. Just as the ceremony began, I stepped forward. The guests turned to look at me, their expressions confused, and I could feel all eyes on me as I walked down the aisle, holding the invitation in my hand. Dan's face went white as he saw me approach. His eyes darted to Sarah, then back to me, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. I stopped just short of the altar, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent, the tension palpable. I could see Dan's lips trembling, unsure of what to say. I didn't need him to explain himself. I didn't need his apologies. I had already heard enough lies. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. The guests, the wedding, the lies. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that I had finally taken control. I was no longer the woman standing in the background, waiting for answers that would never come. I had faced the truth head-on. Without saying a word, I turned and walked out of the church, the sounds of hushed whispers following me. As I stepped outside into the fresh air, I felt a strange sense of relief. The storm inside me had finally calmed. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done being a part of this lie. And whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms.